Look at a map of the United States today. You will see states, highways, farms, cities, military bases, national parks, and private property. Now imagine the same continent before those borders existed. The land was not empty. It was home to hundreds of native nations, each with its own government, language, trade networks, sacred places, alliances, rivalries, and understanding of territory. Then the map changed. Native land became colonial land. Colonial land became state land. State land became farms, railroads, mines, towns, and cities. And generations of Americans were taught a strangely passive version of what happened. Native peoples faded away. The frontier moved west. Civilization arrived. But native peoples did not simply disappear. They were struck by devastating disease. They were pressured into treaties they did not always understand or accept. They were driven from their homelands. They were confined to reservations. Their food systems were destroyed. Their communal land was divided and sold. Their children were taken to institutions intended to replace native languages, religions, and identities with mainstream American culture. This did not happen through one secret order. It was not carried out by one president, one army, or one generation. And it would be inaccurate to claim that every settler or official shared the same intentions. The process changed across regions and centuries. Some people wanted land. Some wanted gold. Some wanted political control. Some believed native peoples should be converted or assimilated. Some openly demanded removal. Others protested it. Native nations themselves made different choices, formed different alliances, resisted in different ways, and survived under different conditions. But across these differences, one pattern repeatedly appeared. When native sovereignty stood between the United States and land it wanted, native sovereignty was treated as a problem. So the real question is not whether every American wanted native people dead. The evidence does not support such a simple claim. The more important question is this: why did American expansion repeatedly produce policies that removed native people from their land, weakened their governments, and attempted to erase their identities? To answer that, we must begin before the United States existed. There was no single Native American culture. North America contained many societies adapted to different environments and political traditions. Some communities built permanent agricultural towns. Some formed large confederacies. Some moved seasonally through established territories. Some depended on fishing, farming, hunting, trade, or combinations of all four. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy developed a sophisticated political alliance in the Northeast. The Cherokee created towns, farms, diplomatic systems, and later a written constitution. The Pueblo peoples maintained agricultural communities in the Southwest. The Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, and other Plains nations developed cultures deeply connected to bison, horses, trade, and movement across large territories. Along the Mississippi, earlier native societies had built major population centers such as Cahokia. The idea that settlers entered an unused wilderness was not a neutral mistake. It became a useful belief. If the land was empty, taking it did not look like conquest. If native people were portrayed as wandering without ownership, their territorial rights could be treated as weaker than European property claims. If their governments were described as primitive, the United States could present its own authority as more legitimate. But native nations understood land in legal, political, economic, spiritual, and historical terms. Their boundaries did not always resemble European fences and deeds. That did not mean the land belonged to no one. The first great disruption, however, was not a treaty or a cavalry campaign. It was disease. European arrival brought smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases into populations with no previous exposure to them. The results were catastrophic. Some communities lost enormous portions of their populations. Leaders died, families collapsed, knowledge disappeared, farms and settlements were abandoned, political alliances weakened. In some regions, epidemics moved ahead of permanent European settlement through trade and contact between native communities. This created a dangerous illusion for later settlers. They entered places where populations had already fallen and concluded that the land had always been lightly occupied. Disease therefore changed the balance of power before many military confrontations began. But disease cannot explain the entire story. Most epidemic deaths were not part of a single coordinated extermination plan. At the same time, later colonists and governments knowingly took advantage of the demographic weakness that epidemics created. War, forced labor, starvation, land seizure, and displacement made native communities more vulnerable to future disease. The distinction matters. It is possible for disease to be unintentional, while the seizure of land after disease is deliberate. It is also possible for a population decline to begin with infection and continue through policy. By the time the United States became independent, disease had already transformed the continent. But native nations remained powerful. They controlled territory. They negotiated with European empires. They could block roads, trade routes, and settlement. That meant the new republic faced a choice. It could recognize native nations as permanent political neighbors, or it could expand across their land. The United States repeatedly chose expansion. The central conflict was land. Land for tobacco, land for cotton, land for family farms, land for speculation, land for gold, land for railroads, land for cattle. Land for new states, land was wealth, political power, and national growth. For settlers, expansion promised opportunity. For governments, it promised taxes, military security, and control. For investors, it promised profit. For native nations, the same expansion meant something entirely different. A road could divide hunting territory. A fort could challenge sovereignty. A farm could occupy a burial place. A mine could destroy a sacred landscape. A railroad could bring thousands of settlers into land protected by treaty. This is why conflicts often followed a predictable pattern. The United States recognized a native nation and signed an agreement. Settlers crossed the agreed boundary. The government failed to remove them or chose not to. Violence increased. A new treaty reduced the native land base. Then settlers crossed the new boundary. The process began again. The language surrounding expansion often made the outcome appear inevitable. The frontier was said to be moving. Settlers were said to be advancing. Native people were said to be in the way. But a frontier does not move by itself. It moves because governments issue land claims, build roads, deploy soldiers, approve railroads, protect settlers, and recognize one form of property over another. The idea of manifest destiny later gave this process a moral story. American expansion was presented not merely as desire, but as destiny. If expansion was destined, resistance could be portrayed as resistance to progress itself. That belief made removal easier to justify. It also transformed native self-defense into an obstacle rather than a political response to invasion. The United States signed hundreds of treaties with native nations. The existence of these treaties proves something important. Native nations were not simply groups living inside American territory without political standing. The government negotiated with them because they possessed land, authority, and the power to resist. But treaties often operated inside an unequal system. Negotiators did not always agree on the meaning of land ownership. Translations could be incomplete. Some agreements were signed by leaders who lacked authority to surrender the territory claimed. Promises of food, money, protection, or permanent boundaries were frequently delayed, reduced, or ignored. And when settlers wanted land protected by treaty, the pressure usually fell on the native nation rather than the settlers. American law also developed doctrines that weakened native ownership. Native nations might possess a recognized right to occupy their land, while the United States claimed a superior underlying title based on European discovery. This created a legal trap. The government could acknowledge native possession and still reserve for itself the power to reduce, purchase, or control that possession. The result was not the complete absence of law. It was a system in which one side increasingly controlled the meaning and enforcement of the law. Native nations sometimes used American courts and won important decisions, but a court ruling was only as strong as the government's willingness to enforce it. The Cherokee Nation would discover that with devastating clarity. By the early 19th century, several native nations in the Southeast occupied land desired by white farmers and state governments. Cotton production increased the value of the region. Gold was discovered on Cherokee land in Georgia. The Cherokee had adopted many institutions Americans claimed to value. They farmed. They developed a written language. They published a newspaper. They established a constitutional government. They used the courts. Their success exposed a contradiction. Removal was often defended by claiming native peoples could not adapt to American civilization. But when the Cherokee adapted, the demand for their land did not disappear. This revealed that the central issue was not cultural difference alone. It was territory. In 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act. The law created the political machinery for moving native nations east of the Mississippi to lands in the West. Supporters described removal as protection. They claimed native people would be safer away from settlers and state governments, but the protection required native nations to surrender their homelands. Between 1830 and 1850, roughly 100,000 native people were moved west through coerced treaties, military pressure, and direct force. The Choctaw, Muskogee, Chickasaw, Seminole, and Cherokee experienced removal in different ways. Some leaders negotiated because they believed resistance had become impossible. Others refused. Some communities split. Some fought. Some escaped or remained hidden. Removal was not one march. It was a system. Its most famous chapter was the Cherokee Trail of Tears. Most Cherokee people opposed removal, yet the United States negotiated the Treaty of New Echota with a small minority that did not represent the elected Cherokee government. Thousands protested. The treaty was still ratified. It surrendered Cherokee territory east of the Mississippi and established a deadline for departure. When most Cherokee families remained, federal troops and state militia began rounding them up in 1838. People were forced from homes with little time to prepare. Families entered temporary camps. Property was stolen or occupied. Then more than 16,000 Cherokee people were pushed west toward Indian Territory. Disease, exposure, hunger, and exhaustion followed the removal. Approximately 4,000 died. The tragedy is often presented as a single terrible mistake. But the policy achieved its intended territorial result. Cherokee land was open to white settlement. That is why the Trail of Tears cannot be understood only as a humanitarian disaster. It was also a transfer of land backed by state power, and it created a model. When expansion demanded territory, the United States could redefine removal as necessity. But even Indian Territory did not remain permanently protected. As the country continued west, land once presented as a final refuge became valuable again. Railroads, settlement, and state building followed. The lines separating native land from American expansion moved once more. After the Civil War, the United States accelerated its control of the West. The Homestead Act offered land claims across areas that were often traditional or treaty lands of native nations. Railroads connected distant markets and carried settlers, soldiers, hunters, and supplies. New mining discoveries produced sudden invasions of territory. Federal policy increasingly confined native people to reservations. These reservations were often much smaller than their original homelands. Movement became restricted. Traditional hunting and trade routes were interrupted. Government agents controlled food, supplies, and permission to leave. When promised rations arrived late or were inadequate, hunger followed. Resistance was then described as proof that native people were dangerous. The language of the Indian Wars can hide the direction of expansion. Many conflicts called wars began when settlers, miners, or troops entered land that native nations believed had been guaranteed to them. Native resistance was not always unified, and native nations sometimes fought one another or allied with the United States against rivals. history was complex. But complexity should not erase the basic geography. The United States was expanding. Native territory was shrinking. Some military campaigns targeted armed resistance. Others attacked communities that believed they were at peace. At Sand Creek in 1864, troops attacked a Cheyenne and Arapaho village in Colorado. At Wounded Knee in 1890, U.S. soldiers killed large numbers of Lakota men, women, and children during an attempt to disarm the group. These events were not every battle, but they destroy the idea that all federal violence was simply defensive. The goal of Western policy was not only to defeat warriors. It was to make independent native control of Western land impossible. One of the most effective ways to do that was to destroy the economic foundation of life on the plains. For many plains nations, bison were food, shelter, clothing, tools, trade, culture, and spiritual life. The great herds supported mobility and independence. During the 19th century, commercial hunting, railroad expansion, market demand, and government indifference drove the bison population toward collapse. Military officers and public figures sometimes welcomed that destruction because they understood its strategic effect. Without the herds, plains nations would find it harder to remain outside reservations. The destruction of the bison was therefore more than an environmental disaster. It was a political weapon, even when much of the killing was carried out for private profit. As the herds disappeared, hunger increased. Communities became more dependent on government supplies. Reservation confinement became harder to resist. The pattern is important. American power did not rely only on direct battle. It also controlled movement, food, trade, and access to land. When military resistance weakened, policy did not stop. It changed form. The next goal was to break apart tribal land and tribal identity. By the late 19th century, many policymakers argued that reservations and tribal governments should disappear. They presented assimilation as a humanitarian alternative to warfare. Native people would become individual farmers. Communal land would be divided into private parcels. Tribal identity would weaken. American citizenship and culture would replace political separation. The Dawes Act of 1887 became the central tool of allotment. Reservation land was divided among individuals and families. Land declared surplus could then be open to non-native settlement. Supporters claimed that private property would transform native people into independent farmers. But the policy ignored different environments, economies, and traditions. It also created a direct path for land to leave native ownership. By the early 20th century, native people had lost tens of millions of acres through allotment and the sale of so-called surplus land. The law did not merely change farming. It attacked the territorial foundation of tribal sovereignty. A nation requires more than individual property owners. It requires a shared land base, government, community, and political continuity. Allotment attempted to replace nations with isolated individuals. At the same time, another system targeted the next generation. If native children could be separated from family and culture, policymakers believed native identity itself could be transformed. Federal Indian boarding schools were designed to assimilate native children. Some were operated directly by the government. Others received federal support while being run by religious organizations. Children were taken far from their families. Their hair was cut. Their clothing was replaced. Their names were changed. Their languages were punished or discouraged. Religious and cultural practices were suppressed. Military-style routines and compulsory labor shaped daily life. The stated purpose was education. But the larger policy connected education to territorial dispossession and cultural destruction. Officials believed that if children were separated from native communities, tribal identity would weaken across generations. The system did not affect every child in exactly the same way. Some students formed friendships, learned skills, or later used their education to defend native rights. Some families eventually chose schools because few alternatives existed. But choice inside a system created by coercion is not the same as freedom. The Department of the Interior's investigation has identified hundreds of federal Indian boarding school institutions across the United States and documented deaths and burial sites connected with the system. The most important evidence, however, comes from survivors and descendants. They describe family separation, loss of language, punishment, abuse, loneliness, and trauma carried into later generations. The boarding school era reveals the deepest meaning of the word erase. The policy was no longer only about removing Native people from valuable land. It attempted to remove Native identity from Native children, yet the attempt failed. Native nations survived. They survived epidemics. They survived removal. They survived military campaigns. They survived reservation confinement, allotment, and boarding schools. Languages were hidden and taught in private. Ceremonies continued despite restrictions. Families preserved stories. Leaders used courts, treaties, activism, journalism, military service, education, and political organizing to defend their nations. Some communities rebuilt governments in Indian territory. Others remained in their homelands despite removal efforts. The 20th century brought new federal policies, some supportive and others destructive. The United States later attempted to terminate the federal recognition of certain tribes and relocate Native people to cities. Native resistance again changed the direction of policy. Today, tribal nations continue to exercise powers of self-government. They operate courts, schools, businesses, cultural programs, environmental departments, and public services. They fight for treaty rights, water, sacred places, language restoration, and the return of ancestral remains and objects. As of 2026, the federal government recognizes 575 tribes, including nations, bands, pueblos, communities, and Alaska Native villages. Federal recognition does not include every indigenous community, nor does it erase the losses of the past, but it proves that Native America did not vanish. The map changed, the nations remained. So why did America try to erase Native nations? The answer was not one emotion and not one event. It was a combination of land hunger, national expansion, racial ideology, economic ambition, political power, and a belief that Native sovereignty could not remain permanent inside the United States. Disease weakened many communities. Settlers wanted territory, governments wanted control, treaties created boundaries, then expansion broke through them. Removal transferred land. Reservations confined movement. Bison destruction weakened independence. Allotment divided territory. Boarding schools targeted identity. Each policy was presented in the language of its own time: security, protection, civilization, education. Progress. But beneath those words, the same question repeatedly returned. Would Native nations be allowed to remain nations with land, authority, and a future of their own? Too often, the answer from American policy was no. This does not mean every American supported removal or assimilation. Missionaries, soldiers, politicians, journalists, settlers, and reformers disagreed with one another. Some defended Native rights, some exposed abuses. Some Native nations allied with the United States. Others fought it. The historical record is not a story with only two simple characters, but complexity must not become an excuse for avoiding the pattern. The expansion of the United States repeatedly depended on reducing Native control of land. When military conquest became unpopular or unnecessary, the method shifted toward law, property, education, and administration. The goal was often described as helping Native people survive. But survival was offered on the condition that they stop existing as independent Native nations. That is why this history still matters. It changes how we understand the American map. It changes the meaning of the frontier. It changes who appears in the story as an invader, a defender, a citizen, or a nation. And it reveals the final truth. Native peoples were not erased. They were not a vanished race belonging only to museums and old photographs. They are citizens of living nations. They are still protecting languages that boarding schools tried to silence. They are still defending treaties signed before many American states existed. They are still rebuilding communities that removal attempted to scatter. The policy failed because identity is not only written on a map. It lives in families, memory, language, ceremony, law, and the decision to continue. America took an enormous amount from native nations: land, lives, freedom, children, time. But it did not take the future. The most honest ending to this story is therefore not disappearance. It is survival. And the question left for the present is no longer whether native nations still exist. It is whether the country that tried to remove them is finally willing to see them clearly.